Hello, trumpet players. In this video, we're going to talk about what's harder to learn, jazz or classical. Usually, the ones that think jazz is harder to learn is the jazz players, and the classical guys think that classical is harder to learn. And the truth is, they're about the same. But I want to spend some time talking about that. First of all, let me clarify that when we're talking about jazz players, we're talking about the guys that improvise, not talking about the guys that can sit in a section, because that is actually pretty easy. Sitting in a jazz section is pretty easy compared to what we're talking about today. So, let's talk about jazz. What makes jazz hard to learn, in my opinion, is how much material you have to learn. You have to learn hundreds of songs. You have to be in fluent command of not just the major scales, but dozens of different scales. There's the language that you have to learn. And the language in and of itself is a lifelong pursuit. Same thing with tunes, right? All of the stuff that you do to be a great jazz player has no meaning without the tunes that you play them on, right? So there's just so much material to be learned. And yes, there's different people who approach jazz improv different ways, and some of them might have more of a shortcut. Shortcuts really, and on either side of this, shortcuts don't really work all that well. But yes, so that's the difficulty of learning how to play jazz, to be a jazz improviser. I think in classical music, yes, we've got literature we have to learn, especially if you're going to be somebody that makes a living, let's say, as a trumpet virtuoso, traveling the world as a guest soloist. Yes, they have to learn literature. But that's not the same as with the jazz guys. With the jazz guys, have you heard that term? Close enough for jazz? I can tell you, that offends a lot of people, right? It offends a lot of people. It's like you're saying that the perfection of what you do is not that the standards for jazz players is so low. But there's some truth to that. When you compare it to whether, a genuine classical player, whether you're a brass quintet player, or if you play churches or weddings, or you play in a symphony orchestra, all of the classical stuff, far, far more involved than learning the literature, is digging deep into the details of what you're doing. Things like intonation, tone quality, the evenness of the attack, stuff like that takes a long time and a lot of hard effort to do correctly. That's why, there's some guys on YouTube that I say, now they're very popular channels, but I tell people that to my ears, they sound like fifth graders. And it's because they never dug into those details like they should have. If they're going to play classical music, they're supposed to dig into those details. Just being kind of in tune is not in tune enough. It's sort of like my brother used to work at Schlumberger. He was a machinist for Schlumberger. And he's the one that introduced me to the concept of tolerances, right? And in classical music, the so-called tolerances are very, very tight. How how out of tune is okay on a jazz gig is very, very, very different from how out of tune is okay on a classical gig. And I know that that kind of talk upsets some jazz players, but it's absolutely true, at least in my career, working at my teacher used to call us um, the guys in the trenches, right? The guys in the trenches at this level at, of my career, right? At this, the kind of gigs I get in the trenches. What I'm saying here is absolutely true. You can have a brass quintet gig and a jazz gig, and how well you play in tune is going to be more important on the brass quintet gig. And so there's the details and all of this stuff are so much more picky, and it takes time. There's students, high school students, that will get solo contests, and maybe that's why I'm talking about this now, because we've got solo contests going on. The most solo contests in Texas are in February, and they'll learn the song and not put any effort into these details. Well, that shouldn't be good enough. And with my students, I tell them that's not good enough. Stuff like the vibrato, it's not just good enough to put vibrato, it has to be an appropriate vibrato. So yes, all of those details that I'm talking about take time. All of those details take time. Now, I can see the opposite argument, and people would say, well, we don't put into the same details as jazz players, but we still care about the details. If you look at the amount of material we have to learn to be a great jazz player, how much effort you put into the details is just a smidgen. I know it happens. Don't get me wrong, I know it happens. Like the guys who say when you learn a transcription, you need to be able to recreate that transcription, recreate that great solo with all of its nuances. That's the closest thing I've heard that comes to what the classical guys have to do. The differences to the classical guys, that's their whole life. I'm going to say that one more time. The classical guys, that level of detail is their whole career, their whole life. The jazz side, yes, we do some of that. But when you compare that to the amount of effort and the amount of time that has to go into just learning huge, huge, huge volumes of material, it's minuscule. So, in the end, not one is not more difficult than the other, One doesn't take more effort than the other. They're just two different, entirely different approaches to playing the instrument well. Two very, very, very different approaches. So they are the same. I'm considering, I used to have a set of articles on my website. I don't think they're there anymore. Um, I called the series Even Steven, and it was a series of articles about how to be successful at both. How can you be successful as a jazz player and as a classical player? I've done it. Maybe some people would say I'm not a very successful classical player. Maybe some people would say that because I don't have all the gigs. The truth is, when I was working the most, the local classical gigs did not pay as much. So it was, I didn't try to get those gigs as earnestly as I tried to get other gigs because the other gigs paid better. I don't think that's necessarily true anymore, but when I was in the thick of it, that's how it worked. You know, you can get, well, I'm not going to, let me put it this way. You can make 3 or 4 times as much money. Not on the jazz gigs, don't get me wrong, but on the commercial gigs. And the guys that get the commercial gigs are usually jazz players because there's so many similarities there. That's not always true, but that's how it pans out, right? And so the commercial gigs pay a whole bunch better than, at least they used to, than the classical stuff. So someone who says, well, you know, you're not as successful as you say you are as a classical player because you didn't have all those gigs. Well, I didn't want those gigs. I didn't want. There were a bunch of gigs like that. I didn't want to work that hard for a fraction of what I was making on the other gigs. I had a family to feed, right? I had a family to feed, and you're not going to do that by just taking the gigs that you want. Anyway, so the point is, I had this series of articles about what steps do you take? I think there were 7 different articles. If that's something you guys are interested in, how to be successful at both, then let me know in the comments so that maybe I can get started on that. Anyway, just a quick video for you today. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next video. God bless you, and see you on the next one. Thank you. Bye.